Hey guys, tonight we're not talking about kings in shining armour or noble queens holding courts draped in silk. No, tonight we're talking about the real engine of power that ran Europe for centuries, the royal mistresses. History likes to paint them as ornaments, pretty playthings tucked away in secret chambers. But the truth? These women didn't just share beds with kings, they ran kingdoms. They decided wars, toppled ministers, bankrupted treasuries, and humiliated queens. And the craziest part? Everyone knew it. From peasants singing bawdy songs in taverns to diplomats writing reports in code, terrified that the wrong mistress could undo an alliance overnight. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy diving into history's dirtiest corners. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing this weird community stretched across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that background hum, and pull the blanket up tight. Because we're about to step into royal bedrooms where politics smelled of sweat, wine, perfume, and scandal. Let's start with the bigger picture. In the Middle Ages, and especially by the Renaissance and early modern courts, the king's mistress wasn't just a secret lover. She could become an official institution. In France, they even had a name for it: maîtresse en titre, the chief mistress. Imagine that. An actual title recognised by court with apartments, servants, and power flowing straight from the king's lust. Queens had crowns, but mistresses often had the king's ear, sometimes literally, as they whispered strategies in bed. And make no mistake, these weren't passive women. The successful ones were predators, survivors, strategists. Many came from modest families, clawing their way into court by charm, wit, or sheer audacity. They knew the game was dangerous. If the king grew bored, if rivals poisoned his mind, if the queen pushed back, their fall could be catastrophic. But while they reigned, they lived like goddesses, and sometimes they ruled more effectively than the kings themselves. Take a moment to imagine life inside a royal palace. Gilded halls on the surface, sure, but underneath, rot. Servants whispering in corridors, ministers slipping bribes to the favourite, queens fuming, while their husbands disappeared into side chambers, perfumed with musk and roses. The mistress sat at the centre of it all, half adored, half despised, always watched. Every jewel she wore sparked gossip. Did the king pay for it, or did it come from the treasury? Every smile she gave a courtier could mean a promotion or a scandal. And at night, behind locked doors, she bent the course of nations with a kiss or a whisper. And it wasn't just France. England, Spain, Russia, the German courts, everywhere, mistresses thrived. Barbara Villiers, in England, practically drained the treasury under Charles II. Diane de Poitiers in France had such a grip on Henry II that even his own queen, Catherine de Médicis, had to step aside. Madame de Pompadour, lover of Louis XV, didn't just keep the king entertained. She steered foreign policy, choosing ministers, even approving treaties. These women didn't just influence power, they were power, but power came at a price. Mistresses lived under constant threat, poisoned by rivals, smeared by pamphleteers, despised by queens. Some ended in exile, banished to crumbling castles. Others died mysteriously after the king's interest faded, and still others burned bright and then fell harder than anyone else. To be a mistress was to gamble everything: body, soul, and future, all for a shot at power no woman could achieve otherwise. Now imagine yourself not as the king, but as the mistress. You're 18, pulled from a minor noble family, trembling as you're escorted into the royal chambers for the first time. The king, bloated from wine, stares at you like a prize. You know that one night could change everything. Not just for you, but for your family. If you charm him, your brothers get titles, your father gets land, your mother brags at court. If you fail, you're discarded, whispered about. Your name turned into a dirty joke. You're not just stepping into a bed, you're stepping into a battlefield, one more dangerous than any war. And the irony? The queens, the legitimate wives married in alliances worth millions, were often powerless. They were locked into dynastic marriages, valued for heirs and political ties, but sidelined when it came to real influence. Many spent their lives humiliated, forced to watch as mistresses paraded through palaces, dripping in jewels that should have been theirs. Imagine the fury. A crowned queen outranked in her own household by a courtesan. Yet again and again, that's exactly what happened. So when we talk about the kings of Europe, their wars, their victories, their policies, we're also talking about their mistresses. The women in their beds shaped treaties, toppled ministers, and sometimes even decided who lived and who died. They ruled not from thrones but from pillows, and their fingerprints are all over the history books, even if historians tried for centuries to brush them away. Welcome to the world of the royal mistress. It's not romance, it's not fairy tale, it's sex, scandal and power, all tangled together in the dirtiest corners of history. And trust me, some of the stories ahead are going to make you blush, gag, and wonder how the hell kingdoms ever functioned at all. If there's a starting point for the official role of the royal mistress, it's Agnès Sorel. Born around 1422 to a minor noble family, Agnès should have lived and died in obscurity. But by the time she was in her early 20s, she wasn't just lying in the bed of King Charles VII of France. She was dining at his table, parading through court in jewels fit for a queen, and bending the will of ministers who once thought women like her disposable. Agnès wasn't just a lover. She was the first mistress recognised as an institution, and she changed the way Europe looked at sex and power. Charles VII, sometimes called the well-served, ironically, had inherited a kingdom in chaos. France was being torn apart by the 100 Years' War. Paris was under English control, and his own legitimacy as king was questioned. Enter Agnès. When she appeared at court around 1444, her beauty was legendary. Chroniclers describe her as radiant beyond compare, with pale skin, golden hair, and a confidence that outshone the most seasoned courtiers. But beauty wasn't enough. What set Agnès apart was her cunning. She knew how to make herself indispensable, not only to the king's body, but to his mind. Within months, Charles was obsessed. He showered her with gifts, jewels, estates, titles. She became Dame de Beauté, literally Lady of Beauty, a title created just for her. Ministers grumbled, courtiers whispered, and the Queen, Marie of Anjou, could only grit her teeth. Agnès appeared beside the king in public, not hidden away. She sat in on councils, influenced decisions, and became a visible, undeniable part of the monarchy. The mistress had stepped out of the shadows, and she was bold. While other women might have hidden behind modesty, Agnès flaunted her power. She wore gowns with necklines so low they exposed her breasts, shocking even by the standards of the 15th century. Portraits of her still survive, showing her proudly bearing herself, hand resting on her stomach in a gesture both sensual and commanding. It wasn't just fashion, it was a statement. I control the king, and I don't care if you know it. But Agnès wasn't only a spectacle, she actively shaped Charles's reign. Chroniclers note that during her time with him, Charles transformed from a weak, indecisive ruler into a more confident king. Some credited Agnès with coaxing him out of depression, urging him to take charge of his armies, to reclaim lost lands. Whether through charm, manipulation, or genuine care, she pushed him into action. And France began to turn the tide in its war with England. Of course, this made her enemies. Courtiers hated her influence. Priests condemned her extravagance, calling her a temptress, leading the king into sin. Satirical songs mocked her body, her power, her jewels. But Charles didn't care. He built her palaces, placed her relatives in positions of wealth, and ignored every attempt to bring her down. Her end, though, was as dramatic as her rise. In 1450, at just 28 years old, Agnès Sorel died suddenly while pregnant with Charles's child. The official story was dysentery, but rumours flew. Some claimed she was poisoned, perhaps by jealous courtiers, or even by Charles's own son, the future Louis XV, who despised her influence. Others whispered darker tales, that she had died from the consequences of her extravagance, her body unable to sustain her appetite for luxury. What's undeniable is this: her death devastated Charles. Chroniclers wrote that he wept openly, refusing food, consumed by grief. He commissioned lavish tombs and statues in her honour, including a famous effigy showing her reclining, serene, breast still bared as in life. Even in death, Agnès was presented as both sensual and powerful, the woman who had redefined what it meant to be a royal mistress, and the precedent she set. It spread like wildfire. After Agnès, French kings routinely maintained maîtresses en titre. The role became so formalised that queens were forced to coexist with them, their humiliation baked into the very structure of monarchy. From Diane de Poitiers to Madame de Pompadour, every great mistress of France owed something to Agnès Sorel. Now imagine the spectacle. You're a French noble in the 1440s. You walk into the royal hall and there she is, Agnès Sorel, seated beside the king, draped in diamonds that could ransom a duchy, her gown cut so low your eyes can't help but look. The queen sits nearby, silent, ignored. Ministers whisper, priests fume, but Agnès smiles because she knows. She holds the king in her hands, and through him, the fate of France. The lesson of Agnès Sorel is simple. Mistresses weren't just ornaments, they were power brokers. And the men who mocked them learned quickly. Underestimating a woman in the king's bed was a fatal mistake. If Agnès Sorel created the role of the royal mistress, Barbara Villiers perfected the art of exploiting it. Known as the uncrowned Queen of England, Barbara was brazen, shameless, greedy, and so intoxicating that King Charles II couldn't resist her, even when she humiliated him publicly. Through her, you can see just how destructive a mistress could be, not only to a marriage, but to an entire kingdom's finances. Barbara was born in 1640 to a family of middling nobility, not poor, but not powerful. From the start, she learned that beauty was her weapon, and she wielded it ruthlessly. When Charles II returned to England in 1660, restoring the monarchy after years of civil war, Barbara made sure she was waiting. She was 20, breathtaking, and bold enough to force her way into his life. Within months, she was his official mistress, and Barbara was no shy court ornament. She flaunted her power at every opportunity. While Queen Catherine of Braganza, Charles's Portuguese wife, struggled to adapt to English court life, Barbara strutted through palaces, dripping in jewels, her dresses cut scandalously low, her laughter loud enough to echo through the halls. She bore Charles at least 5 illegitimate children, parading them openly, daring anyone to deny her dominance. Her influence over the king was total and expensive. Charles showered her with money, titles, estates. He made her husband, conveniently tolerated at court, into an earl so Barbara could become Countess of Castlemaine. She collected pensions that drained the treasury, and when she wanted more, she bullied Charles into granting it. Ministers despised her. Nobles resented her. But Charles adored her, even as she mocked him in public, calling him weak, ridiculing his mistresses, and boasting that she could do whatever she pleased. Barbara's appetite was legendary. She wasn't faithful to Charles, not even close. While he was king, she took lovers openly, from courtiers to actors, and flaunted them in the king's face. At one point, she even boasted that she had taken bribes to influence Charles's decisions, selling royal favours like a merchant hawking goods in the street. And still Charles forgave her, but her greed was impossible to ignore. In one scandal, Barbara demanded $5,000 a year in pensions for life, an astronomical sum for the 17th century. When Charles hesitated, she threatened to reveal his secrets. He gave in. England, already strained by wars and debt, bled money to feed Barbara's appetite for jewels, mansions, and endless luxuries. Public opinion turned venomous. Pamphlets ridiculed her as the curse of England. Satirical poems called her the king's whore, mocking her greed and cruelty. One cartoon depicted her as a harpy clutching bags of gold, while Charles, weak and smiling, held her leash. The people despised her almost as much as they despised the taxes that funded her extravagance, and yet she thrived. Even after Charles grew bored and turned to other mistresses, Barbara remained a fixture. She blackmailed him with his own letters, threatened to expose secrets, and used her children, whom Charles openly acknowledged, as leverage. While other mistresses faded quietly into obscurity, Barbara roared, refusing to step aside. But her downfall, when it came, was ugly. By the late 1670s, her beauty was fading, her debts were colossal, and Charles was weary of her endless demands. Rivals like Nell Gwyn, a witty actress beloved by the public, stole his attention. Barbara clung to her influence, but scandals piled up. One of her illegitimate children was rumoured not to be Charles's at all, but the result of an affair with a soldier. Another time, she was caught forging signatures to cover her debts. By the time Charles died in 1685, Barbara's power was broken. She was forced into exile, living out her final years in relative obscurity, though never truly poor. But her name lived on in infamy. To many, she symbolised everything corrupt about the Restoration Court. Greed, lust, waste, and shameless indulgence. Now picture it. You're a commoner in London in the 1660s, struggling to pay taxes while food prices soar, and then you hear stories of Barbara Villiers parading through Whitehall in a gown worth more than your house, dripping in diamonds gifted from the treasury. You hear she's taken another lover, mocked the Queen, and still receives more money from the king. To you, she's not just a mistress, she's a parasite, bleeding the kingdom dry while you starve. Barbara Villiers shows us the dark side of royal mistresses. She didn't just control a king, she corrupted a court, drained a treasury, and humiliated a queen. And she proved that when sex and power mix at the highest levels, the fallout can be catastrophic. If Barbara Villiers was scandalous excess, then Diane de Poitiers was something far more dangerous. Elegance sharpened into control. She wasn't just a passing fancy of a lusty king. She was a woman who ruled his heart, his body, and his throne for decades. And she did it while being 20 years older than him. Diane was born in 1499 into French nobility. From the start, she was educated, refined, and ambitious. At 15, she married Louis de Breze, a powerful nobleman more than twice her age. It wasn't a love match, but it gave her wealth, status, and, crucially, a place at court. By her early 20s, she was already known for her poise, her intelligence, and her ability to move through court life like a queen without a crown. When King François the Hut died in 1547, his son Henry II ascended the throne. But Henry had already belonged to Diane for years. Their bond started when Henry was still a teenager, a hostage in Spain. When he returned to France, Diane became his guardian, tutor, and mentor. Somewhere along the way, that role shifted into something more intimate. By the time Henry was married off to Catherine de' Medici, the future powerhouse queen, Diane was already firmly lodged in his heart. And Catherine, she never stood a chance. Henry respected her as the mother of his children, but his love, his passion, and his loyalty belonged to Diane. Catherine was humiliated, sidelined, forced to watch as another woman ruled her husband and her court. And Diane didn't even try to hide it. She signed royal documents, alongside Henry, wore the royal jewels, and strutted through court in gowns that made it clear she was the true queen in all but name. The age difference only fueled the scandal. Diane was 2 decades older than Henry, yet he adored her, calling her his eternal lady. She styled herself like a goddess, favouring black and white gowns, presenting herself as the embodiment of purity, even as she shared the king's bed. Chroniclers note that her beauty endured, not because of youth, but because of relentless discipline. She bathed daily, a rarity in the 16th century, and drank cold water laced with gold powder, believing it preserved her looks. Whether it worked or not, it left her skin pale and luminous, and may have poisoned her slowly, but beauty was only part of it. Diane was cunning. She managed Henry's image, directed his patronage, and even guided military decisions. She secured lands, titles, and influence for herself and her family. Nobles seeking favour knew they had to go through her first. Ambassadors reported to their courts that Diane's approval could make or break treaties. In effect, she was France's most powerful minister, cloaked not in office but in desire. Her control went so far that Henry, in a shocking move, gave her the Château de Chenonceau, one of the most beautiful castles in France. It was a gift usually reserved for queens. Catherine de' Medici seethed but was powerless to stop it. For years, Diane ruled from Chenonceau like a monarch, entertaining guests, overseeing estates, and basking in her position as the king's true partner. And Henry's devotion never wavered. He rode into jousts wearing Diane's colours, emblazoning their intertwined initials on his armour. A bold, humiliating statement for Catherine. He entrusted her with state secrets, let her countersign edicts, and made it clear to everyone that she was untouchable. Diane de Poitiers wasn't just his mistress, she was his world. But when Henry died in 1559 from a jousting accident, Catherine finally struck. As regent for her young sons, she moved swiftly to erase Diane. She forced her to hand back Chenonceau, banished her from court, and stripped her of much of her wealth. Catherine had waited decades for revenge, and she took it without mercy. Diane retreated into obscurity, dying in 1566 at the age of 66. Yet her legacy endured. For nearly 40 years, Diane de Poitiers had controlled a king. She turned a teenage prince into a monarch, ruled France in all but name, and humiliated one of the most formidable queens in European history. Her story shows just how far a royal mistress could go, from the bedroom to the battlefield, from whispered promises to treaties that shaped Europe. Now imagine standing in the court of France. The queen sits stiff and cold, ignored. The king beams at a woman 20 years older, radiant in black and white silk, her jewels blazing, her hand resting lightly on his. Ministers bow to her, courtiers flatter her, and the queen grits her teeth in silence. Everyone in the room knows the truth. The real power in France isn't wearing a crown. She's wearing Diane's colours. If Diane de Poitiers was elegance and discipline, then Madame de Pompadour was pure strategy, a woman who turned herself from a commoner into the de facto Prime Minister of France. She wasn't just a royal mistress. She was a politician, a diplomat, a cultural icon, and in many ways, the person who kept Louis XIV's kingdom from collapsing long before the guillotine came for it. Her real name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. That's right, Poisson, meaning fish. Not exactly the kind of name you expect from one of Europe's most powerful women. Born in 1721 to a bourgeois family, Jeanne wasn't noble, wasn't royal, and wasn't destined for greatness. But her mother had a prophecy. A fortune teller once declared that Jeanne would one day reign over the heart of a king. From childhood, she was groomed for that destiny. She learned music, painting, dance, theatre, every art of charm. By her 20s, she was dazzling Paris with her wit, beauty, and above all, her ability to captivate powerful men. In 1745, her fate collided with Louis XV. The king, known as Louis the Beloved in his youth, had grown jaded, restless, and hungry for distraction. Jeanne caught his eye at a masked ball, where she appeared as Diana the Huntress, dressed in silver and feathers. The king was smitten instantly. Within weeks she was installed at Versailles, elevated to nobility, and given a new name, Madame de Pompadour. But Jeanne wasn't content with jewels and silks. She knew mistresses burned bright and died fast. To survive, she needed more than beauty. She needed power, and she seized it. Unlike most mistresses who lived for pleasure, Pompadour embedded herself in statecraft. She charmed ministers, memorized dossiers, and learned the machinery of government. Soon ambassadors realized they had to go through her to reach the king. Decisions about wars, treaties, and taxes were whispered in her salon, not the council chamber. Louis adored her, not just for her body, but for her companionship. Even after their physical relationship cooled, he kept her as his closest confidant. She became his emotional anchor, soothing his rages, distracting him from crises, managing his moods like a master courtier. To keep her influence, she even arranged for Louis's later sexual partners, picking young girls from the infamous Parc aux Cerfs, a private harem at Versailles. While Louis indulged himself, Pompadour remained the woman he trusted with everything that mattered. And she used that trust ruthlessly. She supported allies, destroyed rivals, and positioned herself as the king's indispensable advisor. Ministers who crossed her found themselves dismissed. Those who flattered her rose like stars. She pushed France into the disastrous 7 Years' War, but she also championed culture, commissioning art, architecture, and philosophy. Voltaire praised her. Diderot admired her. She made Versailles a centre of Enlightenment culture, even as peasants groaned under the weight of taxes. Of course, she was hated for it. Pamphlets circulated calling her the chief harlot of France. Cartoons depicted her as a puppet master pulling Louis' strings, or worse, as a diseased courtesan corrupting the throne. Some mocked her bourgeois origins, sneering that a fishmonger's daughter now ruled a king. Others accused her of witchcraft, of poisoning rivals, of using black magic to hold Louis's affection. But no smear campaign could shake her grip. Even her enemies admitted she was brilliant. Unlike Barbara Villiers, who drained treasuries for jewels, Pompadour invested in legacy. She commissioned buildings, sponsored artists, and patronised porcelain factories that still carry her name. Sèvres porcelain, became a European obsession thanks to her. She didn't just spend money, she reshaped culture, and yet her power came at a personal cost. By her 30s, her health was failing. She suffered migraines, fainting spells, and eventually tuberculosis. She continued working, advising and charming even as her body crumbled. In 1764, she died at just 42. Louis was heartbroken. When her funeral procession left Versailles in the rain, he stood at a window and whispered, "The poor woman will not even have good weather." For a king notorious for his indifference, it was a rare glimpse of genuine sorrow. Pompadour's legacy is staggering. She proved that a mistress could be more than a fleeting pleasure. She could be a stateswoman, a cultural force, a ruler in all but name. She turned her bed into a throne, her salons into ministries, and her charm into policy. In an age when women were excluded from official power, she found another route, one lined with silk sheets and whispered secrets. Now imagine Versailles at night, gilded halls echoing with laughter, courtiers scheming in corners, and at the very centre, Madame de Pompadour, radiant, untouchable, smiling as ambassadors bow and ministers tremble. Louis sits beside her, weary and distracted, while she guides his hand, his choices, his kingdom. The crown rests on his head, but the power? It's hers. If Barbara Villiers was hated as the greedy harpy of the Restoration Court, then Nell Gwyn was her exact opposite, bawdy, hilarious, shameless, and adored by the people. She wasn't born noble, she wasn't trained for elegance, and she didn't try to be. Nell started at the very bottom of London society, some say as a child prostitute selling oranges in theatres, and ended up as the king's mistress, remembered not with hatred, but with laughter and love. Few royal lovers have ever pulled that off. Nell Gwyn was born in 1650, the daughter of a brothel madam. Her father was gone, and her childhood was grim. By her teens, she was working in London's theatres, first selling oranges to the audience, then performing on stage herself. Restoration theatre was wild. Bawdy comedies, scantily clad actresses, and audiences that loved filth. Nell fit in perfectly. She was small, quick-witted, and had a tongue sharper than any sword. By the time she was 16, she was a star, playing saucy roles that blurred the line between character and self. Her stage presence caught the eye of Charles II, a king famous for chasing women as eagerly as he chased political stability. But unlike Barbara Villiers, Nell didn't enter court dripping in jewels or draped in silks. She brought her street humour and shamelessness, and Charles fell for it. He called her his pretty, witty Nell. She called him her Charles III, joking that he was her third lover named Charles. That was Nell in a nutshell. Never deferential, never polished, always cheeky. What made her different from other mistresses was her relationship with the public. Londoners loved her. They knew her origins, a poor, rough, scandalous, and they saw her rise as their victory. While Barbara Villiers flaunted her wealth and drained the treasury, Nell joked about her lack of refinement. She once drove through London in a carriage, attacked by an angry mob who mistook her for Barbara. She leaned out the window and shouted, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am the Protestant whore." The crowd roared with laughter, cheering her instead of stoning her. In that moment, she transformed mockery into triumph. Charles rewarded her with houses, pensions, and titles for her sons. But Nell never pretended to be noble. She remained earthy and blunt, swearing, gambling, and cracking jokes that would make courtiers blush. She ridiculed rivals, mocked Barbara Villiers to her face, and even teased Charles in bed. While queens and ministers tiptoed around him, Nell treated him like an ordinary man, and he adored her for it. Her influence, while not as overtly political as Pompadour's or Diane de Poitiers, was still significant. She pleaded with Charles to support her illegitimate children, securing titles for them. She also used her position to help friends, actors, and the poor. One famous story tells of Nell confronting Charles about soldiers left unpaid. She burst into his chambers, scolding him like a fishwife until he promised to release funds. Charles laughed, but he listened, and the soldiers got their pay. Unlike many mistresses, Nell wasn't resented by the Queen. Catherine of Braganza, humiliated by Barbara Villiers and other mistresses, actually tolerated Nell. The two women developed a quiet respect, perhaps because Nell didn't try to replace her. Nell joked openly about her role, making it impossible to resent her the way others were resented. But Nell's life wasn't all laughter. She remained vulnerable. When Charles died in 1685, Nell was suddenly without protection. The new king, James II, was less tolerant, and Nell faced financial insecurity. Yet she was saved by the affection the people held for her. Charles's dying wish was said to be, "Let not poor Nellie starve." The crown honoured it. Nell lived modestly until her death in 1687, at just 37. Her funeral was unlike that of any other royal mistress. Crowds gathered not to jeer, but to mourn. Londoners wept as her coffin passed, remembering her as one of their own, who had somehow conquered a king without ever pretending to be more than what she was. Now imagine the contrast. On one side, Barbara Villiers, glittering, greedy, despised. On the other, Nell Gwynn, dirty-mouthed, barefoot, adored. Both shared the king's bed, but only one won the hearts of his people. Nell proved that sometimes the mistress with the sharpest wit could wield more power than the one with the biggest diamonds. Nell Gwyn's story is a reminder that royal mistresses weren't just ornaments or parasites. Some were survivors, comedians, champions of the common people. And in Nell's case, she became something even rarer, a mistress remembered with love. If Diane de Poitiers humiliated Catherine de Medici during her marriage, Catherine learned quickly how to turn humiliation into a weapon. When she finally became Queen Mother of France, Catherine didn't just use ministers and soldiers to control the court. She deployed a harem of mistresses, young women trained to seduce, distract, and spy. They were called l'Escadron Volant, the Flying Squadron. The name sounds almost comical, but their purpose was deadly serious. Catherine had inherited a kingdom fractured by civil war, religious violence, and endless noble feuds. The men at her court, powerful dukes, ambitious princes, greedy courtiers, couldn't be trusted, so Catherine turned to women. She gathered a group of the most beautiful, witty, and obedient ladies in waiting, and trained them not just in etiquette, but in the art of seduction. Their mission? Infiltrate the beds of the most dangerous men in France and bring their secrets back to Catherine. The Flying Squadron became legend. Chroniclers sneered about them as a troop of harlots, but their influence was undeniable. Noblemen who thought themselves masters of politics suddenly found themselves spilling secrets on pillows, distracted by perfumed kisses. Catherine sat back and watched. Information flowed straight to her, whispered in the ears of her spies. And she wasn't subtle. One of the squadron's most famous missions involved the Duke of Anjou, a rival Catherine needed to manipulate. She sent one of her girls, Charlotte de Sauve, to seduce him. It worked too well. Soon Charlotte had entangled not only Anjou, but also Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV of France. The two men, rivals already, became obsessed with her, so distracted that they could barely focus on politics. Catherine had turned her court into a brothel, yes, but also into a chessboard, with her girls as queens and pawns. But the squadron wasn't just about sex. They dazzled the court with fashion, wit, and scandal. They danced, laughed, and spread rumours. Their presence a constant reminder that Catherine controlled the very air men breathed. Some historians argue that Catherine herself never fully approved of the label flying squadron, that it was slander by her enemies. But whether exaggerated or not, the stories reveal the deep fear men had of women weaponizing desire. And Catherine didn't care if it looked sordid. She cared about results. France in the 16th century was collapsing under the weight of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. Catherine, a Catholic queen ruling over Protestant sons-in-law, needed every tool she could get. If that meant deploying her ladies like spies, so be it. Morality was a luxury France couldn't afford. Of course, the flying squadron scandalised Europe. Protestant pamphlets accused Catherine of running a palace of vice. Priests thundered from pulpits that she had turned France into Sodom. Foreign diplomats reported home, horrified and fascinated, that the French Queen Mother ruled with a harem of prostitutes. But Catherine never blinked. She knew power didn't always wear armour or robes. Sometimes it wore silk gowns, jewels, and smiles. And the women themselves, some thrived. They used their role to elevate their families, secure marriages, and gain wealth. Others were ruined, their reputations destroyed when the game turned against them. A few ended in convents, disgraced and discarded once they lost their usefulness. The squadron was a dangerous game, but one Catherine kept playing, because it worked. Now picture Versailles, or the Louvre in the late 1500s. Men in velvet doublet swagger, swords clinking at their sides, and gliding among them, a handful of radiant women, eyes sharp, laughter calculated. A nobleman leans in, enchanted, not realising that every word he breathes will find its way back to Catherine. Behind a curtain the Queen Mother watches, silent, satisfied. The flying squadron is one of the strangest, dirtiest truths of French history. A queen humiliated by her husband's mistress transformed herself into the puppet master of an entire nation, using sex as her battlefield. In a world where women were supposed to be silent, Catherine weaponized their voices, their bodies, their beauty, and she left Europe scandalized, terrified, and secretly in awe. If some mistresses used charm for politics or culture, others simply bled their kingdoms dry. They weren't content with jewels or a cosy chateau. They wanted palaces, armies of servants, rivers of gold, and kings gave it to them, no matter the cost. These women weren't just lovers, they were economic disasters in silk. Take Madame du Barry, the last great mistress of Louis XV of France. If Madame de Pompadour was elegance and brains, du Barry was pure appetite. She wasn't born noble. In fact, she was born Jeanne Bécu, an illegitimate child who grew up working in a milliner's shop, then a brothel. She was witty, stunning, and ambitious. By her 20s, she was one of Paris's most famous courtesans. Her lovers dressed her in jewels, but she wanted more. And when she caught the aging king's eye in 1768, she struck gold. Louis XV was already weary, old, and desperate for pleasure. Du Barry offered it and demanded everything in return. He showered her with diamonds, silks, palaces, pensions for her relatives, even noble titles for men who had once been thieves. She paraded through Versailles, dripping in gems so heavy they clinked as she walked. Ministers despised her. Courtiers sneered. But Louis indulged her, even when France itself was sliding into debt. Her extravagance became legendary. One story claims that she owned a diamond necklace worth over 1.5 million livres, a sum so outrageous it scandalised the kingdom. She held salons dripping with luxury, while peasants starved outside the gates. When critics called her greedy, she laughed it off. To her, being the king's mistress meant living like a queen, and she was determined to outshine Catherine de Medici, Diane de Poitiers, even Pompadour. But she wasn't alone in bankrupting a nation. In England, Barbara Villiers had already proven how destructive a mistress could be. Charles II poured money into her pockets at a time when the kingdom was still recovering from civil war. She spent fortunes on mansions, gowns, and bribes for her lovers. Some historians argue that her greed alone worsened England's financial crises, forcing Charles into humiliating deals with France just to keep paying his mistresses. In Spain, the royal favourites of Philip IV drained millions through pensions, gifts, and estates. One mistress was rumoured to have demanded entire villages as dowries for her illegitimate children. Villagers paid taxes not to their king, but to the king's lover, and they hated her for it. Even in Russia, mistresses and favourites of the Tsars lived like empresses. Peter the Great's lovers received estates carved from peasants' lands, while Catherine the Great's endless stream of favourites each left court richer than princes. Catherine famously handed out diamonds, serfs and titles to men who stayed only months in her bed. By the end of her reign, critics sneered that she had given away half of Russia to men who shared her sheets. But the most striking part of these stories isn't just the extravagance, it's the fury it sparked among ordinary people. Pamphlets, ballads, and tavern songs portrayed mistresses as leeches, sucking the lifeblood of the nation. They weren't just women in gowns, they were symbols of corruption, of a system that fed on the poor to indulge the whims of the powerful. Every necklace, every palace, every pension handed to a mistress was another spark in the fire that would eventually burn monarchies to the ground. And sometimes the rage turned violent. Madame du Barry learned this the hard way. When the French Revolution erupted, she was arrested, tried, and condemned as the embodiment of royal corruption. In 1793, she was dragged to the guillotine, her diamonds ripped from her neck by the mob. Witnesses said she begged for mercy, screaming, "One more moment, gentlemen, just one more moment." But the blade fell anyway. To the revolutionaries, she wasn't just a woman. She was everything wrong with monarchy, luxury, and lust. Now imagine yourself as a starving Parisian in the 1770s. Bread costs more than you can afford. Your children cry with hunger. And outside Versailles, Madame du Barry struts in diamonds worth a city's ransom. Ministers bow, the king grins, and you know, your taxes are paying for her gowns. You don't see a mistress, you see a thief, a monster draped in silk. Mistresses who bankrupted kingdoms left legacies darker than gossip or scandal. They became symbols of injustice, reminders that kings ruled not for their people, but for their pleasures. And in the end, many of those monarchies collapsed under the weight of that corruption. The mistresses didn't just ruin treasuries, they helped ruin thrones. In the theatre of royal courts, few dramas were as bitter or as humiliating as the one played out between queens and mistresses. The queen had the crown, the jewels, and the title, but the mistress had the king's body, his whispers in the dark, and sometimes his heart. The result was a duel fought not with swords, but with glances, rumours, and endless grinding humiliation. One of the most infamous examples was Catherine de Medici versus Diane de Poitiers. Catherine had been married to Henry II of France as part of a grand political alliance. On paper, she was the queen, destined to rule by his side. But from the wedding night onward, she was sidelined. Henry adored Diane, a woman 20 years his senior, who had been both his guardian and his lover. Catherine was forced to watch as Diane paraded through court in gowns cut low, dripping with jewels Henry had given her. To twist the knife further, Henry even entrusted Diane with the crown jewels of France, not Catherine. Imagine being queen and realising the woman sharing your husband's bed wore the very diamonds that symbolised your monarchy. Catherine never forgot that insult. When Henry died, she struck back with vengeance, banishing Diane and seizing her properties. But for decades, Catherine had been forced to play second to a mistress who ruled in her place. England had its own version of this humiliation. Queen Catherine, a Braganza, wife of Charles II, endured one of the most shameless mistresses in history, Barbara Villiers. While Catherine, a Portuguese princess, tried to maintain dignity, Barbara strutted openly through Whitehall, with the king's children in tow. Charles gave Barbara titles, lands and estates, all while Catherine remained childless and powerless. Foreign ambassadors mocked the queen's weakness. Courtiers laughed behind her back. Catherine had no choice but to endure, trapped in a marriage where the mistress held the real influence. Sometimes the humiliation wasn't just private, it was public, even ritualized. In Spain, Philip IV's mistresses flaunted themselves at court, their children legitimized and paraded while the queen remained ignored. In Russia, Catherine the Great flipped the script, humiliating her husband Peter III by surrounding herself with lovers. But when she seized power, she institutionalized the practice, parading her favourites in ways that mocked tradition and silenced critics. The cruelest part was how little recourse queens had. Divorce was nearly impossible. Affairs were expected for kings. If a queen retaliated, she risked scandal, exile, or worse. Queens were forced into a twisted performance, smiling beside husbands who spent their nights with women younger, prettier, more powerful in their intimacy. Courtiers knew it. Servants whispered it. Pamphlets mocked it. Queens became living symbols of their own irrelevance. But not all queens endured quietly. Some fought back. Maria Theresa of Austria, though not medieval, provides a telling case. She despised mistresses and refused to tolerate them in her husband's court. When rumours swirled of his affairs, she unleashed her wrath on the women involved, driving them out. But her defiance was rare. More often, queens had to swallow their pride, while mistresses thrived at their expense. Now imagine being that queen. You sit on a gilded throne, courtiers bowing, ambassadors flattering. But when the doors close, you know the truth. The king's real loyalty lies elsewhere. His mistress laughs with him, advises him, maybe even decides who rises and who falls at court. You're the queen, but only in name. The mistress holds his heart and through it, his kingdom. This rivalry between queens and mistresses wasn't just personal. It shaped politics. A queen humiliated by her husband's infidelity often saw her authority diminish. Ministers, ambassadors, and even subjects knew better than to rely on her. They turned instead to the mistress, who could whisper into the king's ear at night. This dynamic destabilized courts, warped governments, and left entire nations vulnerable to corruption. The queen versus mistress story is one of power and humiliation. Women trapped in roles defined by men, forced into rivalry when they should have been allies. But it also reveals the twisted logic of monarchy. Crowns mattered, but bedsheets often mattered more. When you picture diplomacy, you probably imagine men in robes leaning over maps, quills scratching treaties, armies waiting for orders. But in the royal courts of Europe, diplomacy was just as likely to happen in a bedroom. There, curtains drawn, candles flickering, A king whispered secrets into the ear of the one person he trusted most. Not his ministers, not his generals, but his mistress. Bedsheets became a second battlefield, and for centuries the fate of nations turned on what happened between them. Kings were weak when they wanted, pliable when they were desperate for comfort. Mistresses learned this quickly. They didn't just entertain, they guided. After a night of pleasure, a well-placed suggestion could tilt a decision toward war or peace. Ministers, watching helplessly, knew that no argument in council mattered as much as a kiss or a caress offered in private. The clever mistresses made themselves indispensable. They didn't nag, they didn't shout, they coaxed. A king worried about an alliance could be soothed into changing his mind with soft words. A ruler hesitant to punish a rebellious noble might suddenly find his mistress reminding him of loyalty and honour, planting seeds that would bloom into orders the next morning. In truth, the bedroom often produced more decrees than the council chamber, and everyone at court knew it. Ambassadors, desperate for favour, sometimes skipped the king entirely and went straight to the mistress. They arrived at her salon with jewels, poems, exotic pets, anything that might win her ear. A smile from her could mean her lover the king signed a treaty the next day. A frown could mean war, but this power came with filth, with gossip, with danger. Courtiers mocked that entire wars were being decided under the sheets. Pamphlets accused mistresses of selling their influence to the highest bidder, turning kingdoms into markets. And in a way they weren't wrong. Many mistresses used their position not only to sway politics but to enrich themselves and their families. A treaty meant bribes, a war meant contracts. Their influence was intoxicating and corrosive. Picture it, the palace at night. The corridors are silent, save for the shuffle of servants carrying trays of wine. Behind a gilded door, the king laughs, the mistress reclines, and their conversation drifts from jokes to whispers about ministers, allies, enemies. The king's hand is in hers. He promises he'll listen, and in the morning when he strides into council, his words echo hers. His advisers rage in silence. They know exactly where the decision came from, but they can't fight it. And when things went wrong, the mistress was blamed. A lost war, her fault, empty coffers, her greed, disloyal allies, her meddling. The same courtiers who once bowed to her now whispered that she was a whore who ruined the realm. Satirists painted her as a serpent wrapped around the king's body, squeezing not just him, but the entire kingdom. Still, kings clung to them, because in truth, they needed them. Mistresses offered something no minister could, loyalty to the man, not the crown. They gave the king not only pleasure, but also refuge, reassurance, and a space where he could be weak. And in return, they gained power sharper than any sword. Sex as strategy wasn't subtle, and it wasn't hidden. Everyone knew it. Everyone gossiped about it, but no one could stop it. Wars, treaties, even the survival of dynasties were shaped not only by swords and speeches, but by whispers in the dark, spoken in the aftermath of pleasure, when a king's heart was open and his defences were gone. For a mistress, the climb to power was glittering, jewels, palaces, whispers that could topple ministers. But the fall was brutal. One day you're carried through gilded halls, your gowns rustling like thunder, your perfume trailing behind you like a crown. The next, you're nothing. No friends, no allies, just silence, debt, and the sting of gossip louder than drums. Royal mistresses lived on borrowed time. They knew it. Every night in the king's bed was also a countdown. Beauty fades, desire cools. New faces arrive at court, younger, hungrier, sharper. And the moment the king's gaze shifted, so too did the entire world. Courtiers who once bowed to you suddenly looked past you. Servants whispered, rivals smiled. You could feel the throne beneath you turning to dust. Some were cast out quietly. One morning, a carriage would arrive at dawn. No fanfare, no explanation, just a polite order, leave. The palace doors that once opened at your touch slammed shut behind you. The jewels stayed. The estates were seized. What you carried away was all you had, and usually it wasn't much. Others were humiliated publicly. Pamphlets mocked their aging faces, their desperation to cling to fading power. Gossip painted them as grotesque, clinging harpies. At court they became living ghosts, reminders of how quickly favour dies. Some, in despair, fled to convents, trading silks for rough habits, the echo of hymns replacing the rustle of silk sheets. In those cloisters they prayed, but everyone knew they weren't there for God. They were there because they had nowhere else to go, and there were darker ends. A mistress who had risen too high was a threat. Poison was whispered about, sudden illnesses striking women in their prime. One day she was radiant, the next she was gone. Her death declared a fever, though everyone knew it was envy poured into a goblet. Others lived long enough to see themselves reviled, their names dragged through streets, their lovers executed or disgraced, their own children branded illegitimate and cast aside. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was obscurity. After years of being adored, feared, envied, a fallen mistress became invisible. She might wander the countryside, living in a crumbling estate, her former glory nothing but a bitter memory. Villagers might point at her carriage, whispering, "That was once the king's whore." No one bowed now. No one begged favours. She was a relic, rotting in the shadow of her own fame. Imagine it. Once you commanded armies of servants. Now you tend to your own hearth. Once you wore diamonds that blinded courtiers. Now you sew your own gowns faded and patched. Once the king leaned into your whispers. Now no one listens when you speak. That silence is heavier than any exile. And yet some mistresses clung on, even in disgrace. They reinvented themselves, finding piety or slipping back into the shadows as advisors to others. But for most, the story was the same. Rise, dazzle, fall, vanish. The bed that made them queens without crowns also made them disposable. They were the brightest jewels in the king's collection. And like jewels, once they lost their shine, they were cast aside. History pretends to forget them. Official chronicles talk of kings, of ministers, of wars and treaties. But look closer, and the fingerprints of the royal mistresses are everywhere. They were never meant to rule, never meant to be remembered. And yet they shaped kingdoms, destroyed dynasties and bent monarchs like reeds in their hands. The odd thing is how memory twists them. For centuries, poets painted them as temptresses, wicked sirens who dragged kings to ruin. Priests damned them as sinners. Historians brushed them off as scandalous distractions. Even today, the word mistress carries shame, dirt, taboo. But strip away the morality, and what remains? These women were power itself, power denied to them through crowns and offices, seized instead through intimacy and cunning. Think about it. The wars that redrew maps, the debts that crippled kingdoms, the treaties that shifted alliances. How many were born not in council chambers, but in bedrooms? Ministers might rage, generals might shout, but at the end of the night, it was often a woman in silk sheets who made the king's decision for him. Some gave comfort, some demanded payment, some whispered strategy. but all of them had the kind of influence no law could grant and no law could take away. And that is why people feared them. They broke the rules. They weren't queens, yet they outshone queens. They weren't ministers, yet they dictated policy. They weren't soldiers, yet they decided wars. A mistress was supposed to be disposable, a pleasure, a secret. But too often she became something more. The shadow monarch, the uncrowned ruler, the whisper behind the throne. No wonder satirists mocked them. No wonder pamphlets smeared them with filth. Mockery was a weapon, a way of tearing down women who dared to wield power in a world that denied them every other route. It was easier to call them whores than to admit the truth, that kings, supposedly the most powerful men in the world, often bent their kingdoms around the desires of one woman. And yet, for all the scorn, they endure in memory, not as saints, not as villains, as something stranger, survivors, women who clawed their way into palaces and made themselves unignorable. Some were greedy, corrupt, cruel. Others were brilliant, witty and visionary. Most were both at once, because to survive in that world, you had to be everything. Picture a palace long after the mistress is gone. The king's portrait hangs on the wall, his wars recorded in dusty books. The queen's effigy rests in marble, cold and noble. But if you listen closely, the whispers you hear aren't about them. They're about her, the woman who walked those halls in jewels she wasn't meant to wear, who laughed too loudly, who held too much sway. The woman everyone pretended to despise but secretly feared. That's the legacy of the royal mistress. They weren't ornaments. They weren't accidents. They were power dressed in scandal, authority disguised as sin, and whether kings admitted it or not, they couldn't rule without them. So the next time you read about a treaty, a war, or a downfall of a dynasty, remember, somewhere behind it, there's probably a woman lying in silk sheets, smiling in the dark, knowing she has just reshaped history. If queens suffered humiliation, mistresses suffered something else entirely. Constant war with each other. Because where there was one mistress, there were always more. A king's appetite was rarely satisfied with a single lover. And the palace corridors became battlegrounds for women competing not just for affection, but for survival. It wasn't flowers and sighs. It was poison in a goblet. It was gossip whispered into the king's ear. It was silk gowns slashed in jealous fits, and rumours of bastard children spread like wildfire to destroy a rival standing. To be a mistress wasn't just about pleasing the king. It was about outliving the others circling him like hawks. Palaces were filled with these invisible jewels. A young beauty might arrive, fresh-faced and glowing, and instantly the established mistress would feel her throne tremble. Servants were bribed to accidentally spill wine on her dress, to trip her in hallways, to deliver her love notes into the wrong hands. If that didn't work, the war turned nastier. Rumours of disease, witchcraft, or treason. A whisper could end a career just as quickly as a sword. Some mistresses even formed alliances, temporary, fragile unions against a common enemy. But those pacts always broke. Sooner or later, they turned on each other. The palace became a pit of vipers, each strike silent, each smile hiding venom. And the king, he thrived in it. To him, rivalry was proof of power. Two women fighting for him was the ultimate indulgence. He played them off each other, enjoying the spoils while the women tore themselves apart. Now imagine walking through a glittering ballroom. The king dances, laughter spills through the air. But behind every jewelled mask, there's hatred. Two mistresses lock eyes across the floor. One smiles sweetly. Tomorrow, she'll destroy the other with a single rumour. And no one, not the queen, not the ministers, dares interfere. This was the real courtly warfare. No swords, no banners, just poisoned glances, ruined reputations, and the endless game of survival played between women trapped in a gilded cage. Being a royal mistress wasn't a free-for-all of silk sheets and easy power. No, it was a dangerous balancing act, with invisible rules that could make or break you. These women lived in a world where one wrong move meant exile, disgrace, or worse, and the rules, they were as strange, humiliating, and twisted as the system itself. Rule 1. Never outshine the queen. At least not too much. Everyone knew the mistress was more important to the king than his wife. But flaunting it too openly risked disaster. If a mistress mocked the queen too boldly, public outrage could ignite. So she had to walk a razor's edge, display her influence, but always with a pretense of modesty. A jewelled necklace here, a sly smile there. The real message was whispered behind closed doors, never shouted from balconies, unless she was reckless, and many were. Rule 2. Produce children, but don't claim too loudly. Illegitimate children were common, but they were also dangerous. They could destabilise dynasties if they seemed too numerous or too legitimate. Mistresses were expected to give king's sons proof of virility, proof of devotion, but those sons had to remain shadows. Too much pride in them, and the queen snapped back, reminding everyone who bore the real heirs. Some mistresses mastered the art of boasting, while pretending not to boast, parading their children, just enough to humiliate the queen, but not enough to risk exile. Rule 3. Be beautiful, always. It wasn't optional. Mistresses lived and died by appearance. Wrinkles, illness, weight, anything less than perfection was a threat to survival. Some drank concoctions of mercury, gold powder, or crushed pearls to maintain their glow, slowly poisoning themselves in the process. Hours every day went into painting faces, arranging gowns, bleaching hair with urine, or bathing in milk. The king wanted a goddess. To survive, you had to become one, even if it killed you. Rule 4. Keep your mouth shut in public, but never in private. At court, a mistress had to act like decoration, graceful, witty, harmless. But in the bedroom, she had to talk. That's where the real influence lived, in whispers, flattery, strategic suggestions dropped at the right moment, silence in public, persuasion in private. It was a kind of performance, an endless play, where the stakes were kingdoms. Rule 5. Never forget you're replaceable. Every mistress knew the truth. There was always another waiting in the wings, younger, prettier, hungrier. To last, you had to constantly reinvent yourself. To keep the king amused, entertained, enthralled. A single week of boredom could end it all. So mistresses learned tricks, costumes, games, secrets, scandals staged for amusement. Some even brought in rivals on purpose, confident they could outshine them and keep the king intrigued. It was survival through spectacle. Now picture the daily pressure. Every step, every word, every glance was measured. Courtiers studied you, hoping you'd slip. The queen glared at you. Rivals plotted behind your back. Ministers hated you. And the king, the only person keeping you alive in that nest of vipers, could tire of you tomorrow. To be a royal mistress wasn't glamorous. It was a job, brutal and exhausting, where the currency was your body and the cost was your soul. The strange rules weren't written in any book, but every woman at court knew them. Break them and you vanished. Follow them and you might, just might, hold on to power a little longer. History loves its kings. It carves their faces into stone, crowns their heads in portraits, names entire eras after them. But look closer at the glittering courts, and you'll see the shadows. Women draped in silk, seated beside the throne, though never upon it. Mistresses. Officially, they were nothing. No title, no crown, no place in the line of succession. And yet for centuries, they ruled kingdoms as surely as any monarch. They were queens without crowns, women who stepped into a world designed to silence them and found ways to bend it. Some were cunning strategists, pulling strings behind closed doors. Some were greedy opportunists, bleeding treasuries dry. Others were survivors, scraping power from men who treated them as disposable. But they all had one thing in common. They mattered. Courts pretended they didn't. Ministers cursed them. Priests damned them. Queens hated them. Pamphleteers mocked them. And yet no one could ignore them, because kings themselves couldn't. The moment a king shared his bed, the balance of power shifted. Policy, war, money, religion, all bent around the woman in his arms. Mistresses reshaped history, and they did it in ways that were scandalous, filthy, sometimes absurd. They turned palaces into battlegrounds of jealousy and rivalry. They turned kisses into treaties. They turned their children into pawns, and their gowns into armour. They were blamed for wars they didn't fight, for bankruptcies they didn't sign, for corruption they didn't invent. But they also carried a truth no one dared admit out loud. Kings weren't really in charge. And that's why their legacy is so complicated. People wanted to see them as parasites, as sinners, as greedy harlots who destroyed dynasties. But history keeps proving otherwise. They weren't accidents, they were the system itself. In courts built on lust, power and spectacle, mistresses weren't intruder, they were essential. Picture it. The throne room filled with gold, the king smiling beneath his crown. Everyone bows to him, but in the corner, behind him, there's a woman. Not a queen, not a minister. She wears no crown, yet courtiers bow lower to her than to anyone else. Because they know the king's decisions tonight won't come from council chambers. They'll come from her whisper in the dark. That's the strange, dirty, unforgettable truth of royal mistresses. They were shadows who outshone queens, ornaments who became rulers, lovers who outlived their kings in memory. History tried to bury them under shame, but their fingerprints are still there, on treaties, on wars, on the very shape of kingdoms. And when you peel back the silk, the jewels, the scandal, what you see is this: women who learned to survive in a world designed to destroy them. Women who found the cracks in the system and made those cracks wide enough to rule through. Women who became queens without ever being crowned.